Okay, go ahead, madam. You can start.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Good evening, students. Welcome you all to the OBG class regarding the NEET or multiple questions. As I've told that we were continuing with the classes in antepartum hemorrhage, and today will be the third part of the same topic. But for the benefit of the students who have joined freshly, I would just like to quickly go through the revision of the antepartum hemorrhage. Mainly, we discussed regarding placenta previa, abruptio placentae, vasa previa, and circumvallate placenta, and all those things. So, starting with the definition, APH is defined as bleeding from the genital tract after fetal viability and before delivery. In the past, viability was considered to be from 28 weeks onwards, but due to the improvements in the neonatal survival, that has been now changed to 22 weeks by WHO and 24 weeks by the Indian Association of Pediatrics. Causes mainly, as we discussed, are these four. And the local causes could be there whenever the patient comes with an APH. Of course, the most common causes are these, but then we have to look for any other cause, local cause, especially in the form of uterine or cervical polyp, cervical carcinoma, varicose veins, or even trauma sometimes would result in the antepartum hemorrhage. Now, regarding placenta previa, the definition is that whenever the placenta is located partly or completely in the lower uterine segment, and the bleeding here is most of the time it is inevitable and unavoidable. It is because of the dilatation of the internal os. Okay, risk factors for placenta previa is mainly very important risk factor is the previous history of placenta previa, multiparity and increased maternal age, previous uterine surgeries like cesarean, myomectomy scars increase the risk of placenta previa, previous uterine curettage, endometritis, increased placental size as in multiple pregnancies, succinturate lobe of the placenta, smoking, and even elevated prenatal maternal serum alpha protein levels, which has been associated with the increased incidence of placenta previa. Mainly remember the increased risk is there whenever there is a previous history of placenta previa, multiparity, and a scar on the uterus. Could be a cesarean or a myomectomy scar, or even damage to the endometrium in the form of uterine curettage or endometritis, that is infection. Then coming to the other factors in the management options. In the management of the placenta previa, we'll have two options. One is expectant management, it is also called as macrophage regime, or an active management that is to terminate the pregnancy. Expected management, the criteria has to be fulfilled when there is no active bleeding, the patient is stable hemodynamically, the gestation age is less than 37 weeks, and you want to continue the pregnancy until 37 weeks, or the expected management can be taken up only until 37 weeks to attain the maturity of the fetal lungs. Okay, beyond that, there is no point in continuing, and the expectant management will end at 37 weeks. Then CTG or the fetal heart tracing should be reactive or normal, and there should be no fetal anomaly on the ultrasonography. These are the criteria for expected management in placenta previa. Of course, remember the expected management will be possible only when the patient is cooperative, in the sense she'll be admitted throughout the pregnancy until delivery, and she'll be monitored every day, and any incidence of active bleeding, again she'll be reviewed, and in case there is a episode of a heavy bleeding, the expected management will have to be cut down, and we have to go for a immediate cesarean section. And all the time whenever the patient is admitted, we have to cross match the blood and keep it ready, because whenever she's having a severe episode of bleeding, immediate blood transfusion can be done. Second kind of management in placenta previa is an active management, where we have to terminate the pregnancy immediately, irrespective of the gestational age. Such conditions or circumstances will be when there is an active bleeding in the vaginal bleeding, the patient is in shock, when the gestation age is more than 37 weeks, and or even if the age is less than 37 weeks, but there's a fetal distress, or there is an IUD, then we have to terminate the pregnancy irrespective of the gestation age, and whenever there is an anomaly or a dead fetus. Right, so these are the two types of management in placenta previa. And another important point in expected management, since we want to wait until the fetal lung maturity is achieved, we give the patient injection betamethasone or any steroid, mainly betamethasone or dexamethasone is given to accelerate the fetal lung maturity in 2 doses. Okay, so we've discussed enough about these points. Um, Next is classification. Here, the placental classification is based on how close it is to the internal os. There is one called Brownie's classification, where placenta previa is classified as type 1, type 2, type 3, and type 4. Type 1 is called as lateral placenta, where it is just dipping into the lower uterine segment. It is not reaching the os. Type 2 is also the marginal placenta, where the placental edge reaches the internal os. Type 3 is incomplete central placenta, which covers the internal os, but not fully covering it when it is fully dilated. Type 4 is also the central placenta previa, where the placenta covers the internal os completely, even when it is fully dilated. So this is the Brownie's classification. In this type, you should remember the type 1 and type 2 are called minor degrees, and type 3 and type 4 are called major degrees placenta previa. In type 1 and 2, it can be anterior or posterior. Another important thing you have to remember is the type 2 posterior type of placenta is also called as a dangerous type, because it is more likely to be compressed during the delivery or during the labor, where it produces cord compression, and it can cause fetal asphyxia and even death of the fetus. So this type 2 posterior placenta is also called as the dangerous type of placenta previa. Another recent classification, which is based on the fetal imaging workshop, has been recommended, where they've divided it into either low-lying placenta or a marginal placenta, where here placenta previa, the os is covered partially or completely by the placenta, and where it was either total or partial. Total means it is completely covering the os, partial it is partially covering the os, as the terminology states. Low-lying placenta was defined when the implantation is in the lower uterine segment, in such that the placental edge does not reach the internal os and remains outside a 2 centimeter wide perimeter area around the os. So such implantation of the placenta we called as low-lying placenta. Okay. Then quickly we go through another important slide. Last time when we discussed, this is very important to differentiate between whether the antepartum hemorrhage is caused by placenta previa or abruption based on the clinical findings. A case scenario would be given where a patient has been brought to you in such a with such presentation or such signs, and then we have to diagnose what is the condition and make the choices based on the options given. So remember, in placenta previa, the bleeding and the pain is sudden, painless, recurrent, always revealed, and bright red in color. Whereas in abruptio, it is associated with severe abdominal pain. It might be revealed or concealed, and it is usually dark red colored. In the signs, in the placenta previa, the pallor is present, which is proportionate to the loss of the blood explained or expressed by the patient. Whereas here it may be out of proportion in the sense when there is a concealed abruption, though the blood loss is massive, which is not visible pervaginally, and the patient appearing pale is not coordinating with the findings. So such may be a situation in case of concealed abruptio placentae. Fundal height corresponds to the gestation age, whereas it is more, sometimes maybe more in the abruptio placentae. Palpation, it is soft and relaxed. Uterus, here it is tense, tender, and rigid. Fetal parts are easily palpated. It is difficult to palpate because of the increased intrauterine pressure and the tense nature of the uterine surface. Head is usually high and floating because the placenta occupying the lower uterine segment will hinder the engagement or fixing of the fetal presenting part, and therefore the head will usually be floating and it will not be engaged. So that is commonly seen in placenta previa. Whereas in case of abruptio placentae, the head is usually fixed because as it is the patient, once there is an abruption, because of the increased intrauterine pressure, it will kind of help the head to fix up, and the patient usually goes into labor in abruptio placentae. So that's why most of the times the head is fixed in abruption. Malpresentations are quite common in placenta previa and very uncommon in abruption. FHS is usually normal here, depending on the degree of the abruptio placentae, various degrees of fetal distress or even IUD will be present. Preeclampsia is not associated, is not having any association with placenta previa, whereas there is a high incidence of preeclampsia patients with abruption. Coagulopathy is rare, whereas it is very frequent in cases of abruptio placentae. So this is an important slide. As I've stressed many times, it is important to differentiate between placenta and placenta previa and abruptio placentae. So last time we discussed many questions related to the same. Now coming to abruptio placentae, is defined as abruption, is defined as hemorrhage occurring in pregnancy due to suppression of a normally situated placenta. The terminology is accidental hemorrhage or premature suppression of the placenta. Then risk factors for abruption are increased maternal age, priority, that is multipara, the more prone for abruption, preeclampsia, chronic hypertensive patients, preterm rupture of the membranes, sudden uterine decompression as it is seen in hydramnios or twin pregnancy, cigarette smoking, thrombophilia, cocaine abuse, previous abruption, external trauma, folic acid deficiency, and uterine leiomyoma. So these are some of the important risk factors associated with abruption. Now, grading of the placental abruption is again an important clinical scenario where you have to remember. And there has been one-page classification for placental abruption where he has divided into 4 grades: 0, 1, 2, and 3, depending on the clinical features. So external bleeding in case of grade 0 is absent, slight, mild to moderate, and moderate to severe. Uterine tenderness is absent. Uterus may be irritable, whereas it is tenderness is present. And in grade 3, you can see tonic uterine contractions with marked uterine tenderness. Abdominal pain is usually absent, may or may not be present. It is usually present, and it is severe degree of abdominal pain is there in the grade 3 variety. Then maternal shock is absent and generally absent in grade 2, but it is most of the times present in grade 3 or the severe variety. Perinatal outcome is good in first 2 grades, whereas it is poor in grade 2 and extremely poor in the grade 3, most of the times associated with IUD as well. Complications like we discussed, that is DIC, acute renal failure, amniotic fluid embolism, all these are absent in grade 0, rarely present in grade 1, may or may not be present in grade 2, whereas most of the times the complications are associated in case of grade 3. The volume of the retroplacental clot, it is less than 200 ml, 150 to 500 ml, and more than 500 ml in grade 3. So this is about the different grades of abruptio placentae. Then quickly we go through. Last time we discussed about DIC as well, which is one of the important complications which is seen in abruptio placentae. Here what happens is there is a release of the thromboplastin in the placental abruption, where there is a breach of the placental barrier, and this thromboplastin is disseminated into the maternal circulation. Okay, so this results in exciting a coagulation pathway within the intravascular system of the mother. So that's why all the clotting factors are consumed, and it's also called as consumption coagulopathy. Other causes of DIC apart from abruption are in conditions like IUD, sepsis, amniotic fluid embolism, and even severe preeclampsia and HELLP syndrome. Patients are prone for DIC. The important thing to differentiate between the normal values and the DIC, you have to remember these normal values of these important clotting factors. Fibrinogen is between 150 to 600 milligram per deciliter. PT is to be between 11 and 16 seconds. That is prothrombin time. APTT is partial thromboplastin time, 22 to 37 seconds. Platelets should be between 1.5 to 3.5 lakhs. D-dimer should be less than 0.5 grams, and FDPs, that is fibrin degraded products, should be less than 10 micrograms per deciliter. These are the normal values, and anything which is deranged would suggest to DIC. So a typical picture of the DIC is that the fibrinogen level is decreased. That is because of the consumption of the fibrinogen, because of the inciting of the clotting within the intravascular system. PT and APTT both are raised. Platelets are decreased. The D-dimers are increased, and the fibrin degraded products also are increased in case of DIC. So this is a typical picture of the patients with DIC. So management mainly involves transfusion of the fresh frozen plasma. Cryoprecipitate is also used, and platelets transfusion should be given whenever the platelets is less than 50,000 per ml. And of course, if the female is Rh negative, she has to be given 300 micrograms of anti-D as a prophylaxis, and delivery is the answer or is the management protocol for DIC once the patient is stabilized. We also discussed about vasa previa, which is a rare condition, about 1 in 2,000 to 3,000 deliveries. But you have to remember, it may be present in velamentous cord insertion, bilobe placenta, succinturate lobe placenta, placenta previa, or even in a pregnancy resulting from IVF or multiple pregnancies. The most important differentiating factor here is that the bleeding, the pervaginal bleeding will be very less compared to the placenta previa or abruption, but the amount of the fetal distress caused by even this little bit of bleeding will be tremendous, in the sense there will be associated fetal distress or even IUD, because the bleeding which is occurring here in the pervaginum is actually the blood from the fetal blood vessel. So the fetal blood is the one which is exsanguinated. That's why it will cause a very high degree of fetal distress, even though the blood loss may be lesser. That's an important feature in vasa previa. So students, are you all there?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. I'll just continue with the same thing. Yeah, one important test which differentiates whether the blood loss which is there in the placenta previa or abruption, it is the maternal blood, and in vasa previa it is a fetal blood. So the tests which would differentiate this, whether the bleeding is from the mother side or the fetal side, there are two important tests, that is the apt test and the Klehoe-Betke test. Apt test is actually a qualitative test which will just tell us whether the blood is maternal or fetal, whereas the Klehoe-Betke test is quantitative, in the sense it will also assess the amount of the blood loss which has occurred in the fetus. So both can be used for differentiating whether it is a maternal or fetal blood. Though that's about vasa previa. Yeah, we discussed about the DIC. So regarding the DIC, the important features, as we discussed, the laboratory changes we discussed in the last slide. There is the bedside test. Earlier we would do for identifying if the patient is in the DIC, especially any patient of abruption coming. We used to take the sample of the blood and keep it for important bedside test that was called as a clot observation test. And there is another continuity of the same thing, that is clot stability test. So in the clot observation test, what we would do is 5 ml of venous blood is taken and placed at 37 degrees centigrade. Normally the blood has to clot within 6 to 12 minutes, but if the fibrinogen level is less, in case of how it happens in case of DIC, the blood does not clot even beyond 30 minutes. So it is a rough idea. It gives a rough idea about the blood level of the fibrinogen. And if the clotting time is less than 6 minutes, then we can assume that the fibrinogen level is more than 150 mg/cent. But if we're taking more than 30 minutes, then we can assume that the fibrinogen level is probably less than 100 mg/cent, and the patient might be in a state of DIC. Continuing with the same test, the same blood clot we would observe for stability. So if the clot, whatever has been formed, does not lyse or disintegrate within 24 hours, then it shows that it is normal. But if the clot dissolves within 24 hours, it shows that the patient could be in a DIC. So this was a continuum of the bedside test, that is also called as the clot observation test or the Wiener's test. So these are two important bedside tests. So that was about DIC. And as we discussed, the important points in the management would be fresh frozen plasma and cryoprecipitate, and of course platelet transfusion. Right. So I think we ended the last class here, and we'll proceed further with the next questions. Any doubts about these two topics right now? Anybody has anything to ask or suggest? Or we shall continue with the class. Hello, students. Are you all there?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. Okay. So let's continue with the class then. I hope more people have joined the class. Yeah, so we have a good number of people. Let's continue with the class then. So what I'll be doing is like I'll be taking up the questions related to this topic, and as and when possible, we'll discuss the points as well as the theory part of it. Okay, so continuing with the class, coming to this question, a 26-year-old female suffers from postpartum hemorrhage on her second postnatal day. Her APTT and PTT are prolonged while BT, PT, and platelet counts are normal. Likely diagnosis is acquired hemophilia, lupus anticoagulant, DIC, or inherited congenital hemophilia. I want the students to participate here and please give the answers, whatever it might be, right, wrong. You can reason it out as to why is that choice. We can always, discuss about the possible options later on. So, can anybody give me the answer for this question? See here, they say that
Inherited congenital hemophilia.
inherited congenital hemophilia. See, congenital hemophilia will present in quite an early period in the form of menstrual disturbances, menorrhagia. So the patient usually may not kind of be able to get married, get pregnant, and then present to you as a PPH. Understood. So usually inherited congenital hemophilia will present right from the childhood in the form of excessive bleeding with bruises and gum bleeding and all that, and even menstrual disturbances will be there. So I don't feel, I mean, this option is ruled out. Inherited congenital hemophilia is ruled out. See, DIC as an option can be ruled out again because here they say the BT, PT, and platelet counts are all normal. So what we discussed in the few previous slides, whenever there is a DIC, it's a consumptive coagulopathy. Consumptive coagulopathy means all the clotting factors, including the platelets, will be consumed. Right. So the prothrombin time as well as the partial thromboplastin time, which depicts the different pathways in the coagulation system, are prolonged, and even the platelet counts will be lesser, or there will be thrombocytopenia and DIC. So this option is also ruled out because here they mentioned that the BT, PT, and platelets are normal. Okay, so we are left with two options, that is acquired hemophilia or lupus anticoagulant. What do you think is the right option? Anybody? See here, her APTT and PTT are prolonged. So which pathway does these two tests represent? Whether it is intrinsic pathway or extrinsic pathway in the clotting system. If you go back to the clotting mechanism, there are intrinsic, extrinsic, and the common pathway, is it not? So there are different clotting factors which are involved in these two pathways. Yes, anybody? Well, I'll give this answer here. I'll not waste more time here. The answer is A, that is acquired hemophilia. Okay, so we'll just reason it out in the next few slides. I would like to just quickly go through this. See, remember the coagulation cascade, we have the extrinsic pathway and the intrinsic pathway, right? So the intrinsic pathway will involve the factors 12, 11, 9, and 8. And the partial thromboplastin time is the one which is depicting any derangement is in this pathway, that is the intrinsic pathway. Whereas extrinsic pathway starts with the tissue factor, and this factor 7 is involved here, and prothrombin time is the test which is representing the extrinsic pathway. So then they both have a common pathway, that is starting from the factor 10, where it is acted upon by factor 5, calcium, and lipids, resulting in the formation of thrombin, and the prothrombin acts here, resulting in conversion of the fibrinogen to fibrin clot. So here there are again different factors involved. So you can remember this slide, which is important. Extrinsic pathway, intrinsic pathway, the different factors, as well as the common pathway where the other factors are involved. So this is an important slide, remember. So then you will understand when is the prothrombin time abnormal, when is the partial thromboplastin time abnormal. In case of DIC, as we said, all the factors are consumed. So the prothrombin time is raised, partial thromboplastin time is also raised, and because there is a consumption of the fibrinogen level, the fibrinogen is converted into fibrin clots of the fibrin products. Fibrinogen level will be decreased, and fibrin degraded products later on after the lysis of this fibrin clot, the FDP is what we call, will be increased in case of DIC. It's clear for all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So this is the same thing again. We have the different tests like the bleeding time, clotting time, prothrombin time, as well as the APTT or the PTT. Here it indicates abnormality in the number and functions of the platelets, whereas it is abnormal in idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura, anaphylactic purpura, or leukemia. The clotting time or the prothrombin time indicate the extrinsic and common pathway coagulation. Factor 7 deficiency is the condition where it is abnormal. APTT indicates the intrinsic and common pathway coagulation, and it would indicate the abnormalities involved with factor 8, 9, 11, 13 deficiency, and also von Willebrand's disease. So as we discussed, both PT and APTT are prolonged in case of vitamin K deficiency, severe liver diseases, factor 5, 10, and fibrinogen deficiency, as well as in the DIC. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So in lupus anticoagulant, what happens is the laboratory findings. Here, the PT is prolonged, APTT is prolonged. Kaolin clotting factor or the time is also prolonged, and diluted Russell-Viper-Winone time is also prolonged, and it is not corrected by addition of plasma, but addition of excess phospholipid. So this is one finding or the features of the lupus anticoagulant. In DIC, what happens is, as we discussed, all the things are prolonged, fibrinogen is decreased, FTP is increased, and platelets also decreased. In hemophilia, since it is due to the deficiency of the factor 8, the PTT will be prolonged, indicating the abnormality in the intrinsic pathway. PT and the PT are normal because the platelet count is normal, the BT will be normal, and PT is normal because the extrinsic pathway is normal here. So these are the differentiating features between lupus anticoagulant, DIC, and hemophilia. Is it clear for all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So we'll just proceed further. Now, you have to differentiate between acquired and inherited congenital hemophilia. Here, remember, inherited congenital hemophilia is extremely rare in females because it is most of the times a X-linked disorder, and it is seen mainly in the males. Okay. Acquired hemophilia is a disorder in which the antibodies develop against the coagulation factors later in the life. And this can develop against one coagulation factor or even against several factors. So the most common target protein is for the factor 8. So here the factor 8 is affected most commonly in the acquired type of hemophilia. So anti-factor 8 antibodies are seen in hemophiliacs, postpartum females due to drugs, as well as in SLE and normal elderly individuals also. The patient in the question here, in that particular question, what we discussed is a postpartum female, okay, who has developed antibodies against the factor 8, and therefore she will be a case of acquired hemophilia. So is it clear for all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. The next question. I would just like to pause here because I'm getting an emergency call. I'll get back to you in some time, okay?
Okay, ma'am.
Just hold on, all of you. Please wait for some time. Yeah, hello students. I'm sorry I had to take a break. There was an emergency call. Hope you are all there.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, you are able to see the screen, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Fine. So we'll continue with the next question. There is this one: amniotic fluid embolism. The causes are when the patient is in shock, DIC, a bleeding tendency, all of the above. What is the answer for this one? It's quite a simple one. So when do you see an amniotic fluid embolism in any patient? Of course, in DIC, we see amniotic fluid embolism as we discussed earlier,
Yes.
is it not?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So actually, the question is not very correct, but these are the features associated with amniotic fluid embolism. That is shock as well as bleeding tendency is there. Because the patient is in DIC, most of the time the patient will have a bleeding tendency. So it's not a complete question. They've just asked cause here and then given the features. But we would go with the all of the above option here. That is the D, because these three are possible features seen in amniotic fluid embolism. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So continuing with the next one. I'll just briefly tell you about the amniotic fluid embolism. Now, usually this is a very fatal syndrome, and it is characterized by abrupt onset of respiratory distress and coagulopathy in a patient, in a pregnant patient, of course. So it is considered as a cause of peripartum collapse. It is diagnosed clinically. Two important things are there. One is embolic component causes acute respiratory distress syndrome and ultimately death if not intervened immediately. Most of the patients are not lucky, and by the time they are shifted to for the intubation or preparation, they usually die. In a matter of seconds, the patient dies because it's a huge embolus and severe respiratory and acute respiratory distress result in cardiac failure. Coagulation failure also is there, typically seen in amniotic fluid embolism, which causes hemorrhage, DIC, and consumptive coagulopathy. Classically, a woman in late labor, okay, when the patient is in the late labor, almost the time of delivering or at the time of second stage or third stage, or immediate postpartum, immediately after the delivery. So this is a time when there has been higher incidences of amniotic fluid embolism, late labor or immediate postpartum. She's present with sudden gasping of air, severe bronchospasm. She becomes cyanotic and undergoes an immediate collapse. So cardiorespiratory arrest usually is accompanied. This associated with hemorrhage. So this is a typical feature of the amniotic fluid embolism. Sudden death is usual, as we discussed. So most of the time, the amniotic fluid embolism is seen after ARM, and that is artificial rupture of membranes when we see at cesarean section sometimes, and in labor with the strong uterine contractions and immediate postpartum. These are the typical times when the patient might go into amniotic fluid embolism. The next question. Now, an elderly multiparous woman with intrauterine fetal death was admitted with strong labor pains. The patient suddenly goes in shock with cyanosis, respiratory disturbance, and pulmonary edema. The most likely clinical diagnosis is rupture of uterus, congestive heart failure, amniotic fluid embolism, or concealed accidental hemorrhage. The answer should be easy now since we've discussed, about that condition previously. Which is the most likely diagnosis here with this typical features, what they have mentioned here. She's multiparous, elderly, multiparous, IUD, strong labor pains, and suddenly goes in shock with cyanosis and respiratory distress and pulmonary edema. So these features are typical in which condition?
Amniotic fluid embolism.
Yeah.
Fluid embolism.
Fine, amniotic fluid embolism. So it is clear, right? There shouldn't be any confusion. You might get congestive heart failure and rupture uterus are not very typical causes of these features. So these two are ruled out. whereas we might get confused between amniotic fluid embolism and concealed accidental hemorrhage. Okay, so here there could be a possibility of concealed accidental hemorrhage because they say that there is an IUD, which is a feature in abruptio placentae. But remember, the patient doesn't go into shock, cyanosis, and respiratory distress here in case of accidental hemorrhage. They might go into shock because of the blood loss. There could be hypovolemic shock, whereas not a cardiogenic shock as seen in case of amniotic fluid embolism. So remember, these two could be confusing, but because of features mentioned here, the answer is amniotic fluid embolism. All agree with me? Yeah. Fine, let's proceed.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, a few more features about amniotic fluid embolism. It is diagnosed clinically with risk factors like advanced maternal age, tetanic uterine contractions, uterine rupture also sometimes associated with amniotic fluid embolism, premature separation of the placenta, multiparity, use of uterine stimulants, cesarean section, intrauterine fetal death. So these are the conditions associated. What happens here is the amniotic fluid enters into the maternal circulation. It results in the breach of the physiological placental barrier that normally exists between the maternal and the fetal compartments. So any cause leading to this mixing of or breaching of the normal placental barrier, such as cesarean section, premature suppression of the placenta, that is abruption, rupture uterus, etc., will predispose for the amniotic fluid embolism. So this results in the dissemination of the amniotic fluid. Along with that, the fetal products like Lanago and fetal hair, all that will be disseminated into the maternal circulation, and pathologically in the postmortem, we sometimes they have been demonstrated the presence of these features, fetal features of fetal tissues, that is the Lanago and the hair, fetal hair present in the the lungs of the patient. Postmortem pathological findings have been demonstrated, which that is one of the important pathological features in amniotic fluid embolism. So as we discussed, management is aimed at minimizing the hypoxemia, immediate attention in the form of intubation, supplementing with the oxygen, and putting the patient on the ventilator. Artificial ventilation is the answer, and very few patients are lucky enough to actually have these facilities handy immediately. Most of the time, if it happens in a ward or even in the hospital, it's difficult to kind of arrange all these things in few seconds, and most of the patients end up in death. Only if the event occurs on table, for example, when the patient is undergoing a cesarean section and such an event occurs on the table, the patient is lucky enough, you have all the resources there, the intubation thing is ready, the ventilation is there, the anesthetist is there. So immediate intubation and ventilation, if possible, the patient can be salvaged. Otherwise, most of the times it causes a very high mortality. And of course, one is to restore the airway, and hypoxemia is to be restored with supplemental oxygen. And as we discussed, it is associated with DIC as well most of the times, and the patient might have hemorrhage, and that has to be managed along with the management of the oxygen supply. So this is about amniotic fluid embolism. Clear to all of you? So we'll go ahead with the next question. Are you all there? There is no disconnection, right? Students?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So there was no disconnectivity in between, right? So shall we go ahead?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So the following tests are related to blood coagulation disorders in obstetrics, except. That means we have to choose a statement which is wrong. Okay. First one, A. Thrombocytopenia is a feature of fibrinolytic process and not of DIC. B. In DIC, RBC will be helmet-shaped or fragmented, but in fibrinolytic process, the cell morphology is normal. C. Wiener clot observation test gives a rough estimate of total blood fibrinogen level. D. Thrombocytopenia can be diagnosed from the peripheral smear. So, which of the statements here is wrong or not or incorrect in the other terms? I'll read them again. Thrombocytopenia is a feature of fibrinolytic process and not of DIC. In DIC, RBC will be helmet-shaped or fragmented, but in fibrinolytic process, the cell morphology is normal. Wiener clot observation test gives a rough estimate of the total blood fibrinogen level. Thrombocytopenia can be diagnosed from the peripheral smear. Anybody with the answer? Which statement is incorrect here? In other words,
A,
yeah, that's
option
the
A.
right answer. Because what I've mentioned here is thrombocytopenia is not found in DIC. Whereas, as we discussed earlier, because DIC is nothing but consumptive coagulopathy, where all the clotting factors, including the platelets, are consumed, there will be thrombocytopenia in DIC, is it not? So this statement is wrong, and that's why this will be the answer for this question. Whereas all the other three options are right. See, in DIC, there is hemolysis, and therefore the RBCs will be like distorted in the form of helmet-shaped cells, which are seen in the peripheral smear. As we discussed, Wiener clot observation test is a bedside test, which will tell us the rough estimate of the level of the fibrinogen in the blood. And as we discussed, thrombocytopenia can be diagnosed in the peripheral smear, is it not? Where the pathologist will be able to comment whether the number of the platelets on the peripheral smear is adequate or there is a thrombocytopenia. So all the three statements are correct, and this being incorrect, this will be the answer for this question. Clear with all of you? Right. So
Yes,
next, there's a very easy question in the sense, which is the most common cause of antepartum hemorrhage? Is it placenta previa, abruptio placentae, vasa previa, or placenta accreta? See, vasa previa and placenta accreta we know are quite rare, okay, with our knowledge. So the option would be left between placenta previa and abruption. So amongst these two, which is the most common cause in antepartum hemorrhage? The incidence, if you all remember the incidence of placenta previa and abruptio placentae. Anybody? I would give here the answer because taking time. The answer is placenta previa, A. Okay, that's the most common cause of antepartum hemorrhage. So here, to give you the literature, abruption is in 1 in 200 deliveries. Placenta is, sorry, I think this is interchange. Placenta previa is 1 in 200. Abruption is 1 in 300 to 400. Vasa previa is 1 in 2000 to 3000, and placenta accreta in 1 in 533 deliveries. So this is the yes.
Ma'am, slides are not seen.
You're unable to see the slides?
No, ma'am.
How about others? Everybody else is able to see the slides?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Please check your own system. Whoever just informed that you're unable to see the slides, please. There could be some connectivity issue, or the network could be low, so that it is not streaming.
Okay, ma'am.
Right? So I'll continue, and let me know if you're facing the same problem. Maybe you could change your internet source.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay. So continuing, as we were discussing the incidence of different causes of antepartum hemorrhage, right? Is it clear with all of you? Just remember these points. Now coming to the next question, this is an image-based question. All of you can see an image here of the placenta and some abnormality. Now, after seeing the picture properly, the following, which of the following is the cause or the picture depicting here? Is it molar gestation, placenta accreta, acute abruption, or acute abruption or partial abruption? Anybody? What you can see in the picture here, you can see the placenta, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So the placenta has two surfaces, is it not? The fetal surface and the maternal surface. So what you can see here, which surface you are seeing here? You can see the cotyledons here. So the cotyledons are seen on the maternal surface, is it not? And the umbilical cord is attached behind here, so that will be the fetal surface. So what you can see here, this is the normal appearing placenta, and here you can see the blood clots, which are attached on the maternal side of the placenta. Is it not? Is it clear to all of you? Are you all able to see the slide?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so please be interactive so that, you know, I can be assured that you're all with me. Right, so you're able to see some blood clot here, right? This black thing, whatever you're seeing, is a blood clot which is attached to the maternal surface of the placenta. So when do you see a blood clot on the maternal side? Or it is also a retroplacental clot? Because the retroplacental, in the sense, whenever you're delivering the placenta, the first surface which comes out is the fetal surface, because the umbilical cord is attached there. So when you're delivering the placenta, most of the times you're pulling along the umbilical cord, and the fetal surface is the one which is delivered first. So behind that, whatever is there, that is the retroplacental area. That is also the maternal side of the placenta, is it not? So whenever you're seeing a clot on the maternal side of the placenta or the retroplacental clot, what is the most common cause for retroplacental clot? When is the retroplacental clot caused? It is because of the premature separation of the placenta, is it not?
Yes, ma'am.
So whenever there is a premature separation of the placenta, that results in the formation of a blood clot behind. So the answer here, it is so simple. I don't know why you people are taking so time. Is it not clear in the picture? You're having a retroplacental clot here. So the answer would be abruption. So it is either acute abruption or partial abruption. Here they've given two options. So any one would be correct actually. But since you're seeing a old, you know, blood clot here, it is not fresh in the sense it is very dark colored. So we can assume that it's not an acute abruption. Okay. So the answer for this question would be partial abruption, since the clot is present or occupying only part of the surface of the whole placenta. It shows that the abruption is partial here. Okay, so the whole placenta is not separated, but only there was a small surface of the placenta which was separated, resulting in the partial abruption. Understood? So is it clear for you all? The answer is partial abruption here. Yeah, are you all there? Is there any disconnectivity? I'm not sure. I'm not getting any response from you all.
No, ma'am, you can continue.
Okay, fine. Right, so this question is clear, right? You will continue the next one. Now, your patient is a 22-year-old gravida to para 1 at 36 weeks gestation with a history of prior abruption during a spontaneous vaginal delivery. Which of the following might be effective for preventing recurrence during this pregnancy? That A option is antepartum testing, delivery at 38 weeks, cesarean delivery at 38 weeks, and cesarean delivery at 39 weeks. So analyze the question here. She is 36 weeks gestation, and there is a previous history of abruption. And here they've also mentioned when did she have the abruption. It was only during her spontaneous vaginal delivery, not earlier in the antepartum period. Okay, so of course the risk of abruption is increased in the subsequent pregnancies, as we all know, right? So the timing also would be significant here. So whenever there has been an abruption in the previous pregnancies, we should be able to assess at what gestational age she has got the abruption, so that we decide about the delivery before she reaches that risk period in her pregnancy, so that if at all there is a recurrence, we do not end up she having an abruption in the same gestational period of the pregnancy. Understood? So accordingly, which option do you think is the correct one here? Antepartum testing is
Hello? 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 Hello?
Got muted.
Hello?
sorry, the audio had gone mute.
Yeah, yes, madam.
Yeah, now is it audible to all of you?
Yes, madam.
Okay,
Yes,
so I'll proceed with the presentation. So I was there with this question. So was it audible until here?
Yes, ma'am.
yes, ma'am.
Okay, so here we were discussing about this question, right? So the history is there of pre-abruption, and she has developed it in the during her vaginal delivery. So important point to note here is that there is a history of abruption, so the risk of abruption in subsequent pregnancies also increase, and the timing is also important in the sense when did the patient develop abruption in the previous pregnancy, so that if at all it recurs, usually it recurs in the same gestational age or period, and we should take precautions in the present pregnancies to make sure that she does not go into the abruption in that particular period of gestation. So once the patient has achieved a maturity, that is at around 38 weeks of gestation, we ideally have to deliver her, so that we do not prolong the pregnancy into the later stages, so that she might end up in the abruption in such case. So here amongst the options, when we discuss this, antepartum testing is not a good option, in the sense there is no test which will predict whether the patient is going to have an abruption or no. Of course, there are few risk factors which we can keep it in mind, like patient with a chronic hypertension, preeclampsia, folic acid deficiency, or previous history of abruption. So there is no actual testing which would predict that the patient would have an abruption. So this is not an option. Now, amongst these two options, that is cesarean delivery at 38 weeks and 39 weeks, see, the patient has had a previously vaginal delivery. Okay, and this pregnancy, there is no other risk factor what they mentioned to take her up directly for cesarean delivery. Understood. So these two options are not appropriate for this question. So the right answer here is B, that is delivery at 38 weeks. Since the patient is now 36 weeks, another 2 weeks down the line, she turns 38 weeks, and then we induce her and deliver her at around 38 weeks, so that we do not allow her to go into the risk period of developing another abruption. So is it clear for all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Right, we'll proceed to the
Yes,
next
ma'am.
question. Which of the following is true concerning placental abruption? It may lead to a dilutional coagulopathy. B option, that is concealed abruption forces thromboplastin into large veins, draining the implantation site. C, in most women with abruption severe enough to kill the fetus, the plasma fibrinogen level will be less than 150 milligram per deciliter. All of the above. Which of the statements is true here? The first statement, if we take abruption leads to dilutional coagulopathy. Is it a dilutional coagulopathy or what type of coagulopathy is seen in placental abruption? Anybody? We discussed in length about this particular problem, that is DIC, which is there in a placental abruption. What type of coagulopathy it is? So there are two types, dilutional coagulopathy and another one is consumptive coagulopathy, is it not? So what type of coagulopathy is seen in placental abruption? DIC is seen. So DIC is it a dilutional coagulopathy or a consumptive coagulopathy? See what is happening in DIC? Yeah, in DIC, all the clotting factors are getting consumed. There is an insight of the clotting occurring within the intravascular system of the body of the patient, is it not? So it's a consumptive coagulopathy. It's not a dilutional coagulopathy. Understood? So the first option is ruled out. Do you all agree with me?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So now coming to the second point, that is concealed abruption forces the thromboplastin into the large veins, draining the implantation site. This is a right statement or a wrong statement? So in the pathophysiology of the DIC, it has been explained, is it not, that whenever there is a suppression of the placenta, there is a breach of the placental barrier, and that will result in the dissemination of the thromboplastin into the large veins of the mother or the maternal intravascular system, is it not? So the second statement, that is B, is actually the right statement. So this could be the correct option for this answer, for this question. Do you all agree?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So coming to this third option, in most women with abruption severe enough to kill the fetus, the plasma fibrinogen level is, they've given the value is 150 milligram per deciliter. But remember, for a fibrinogen level to be considered as very low, the cutoff is 100 milligram per deciliter. Okay, so in severe cases where the fibrinogen level is less than 100, that is severe enough to cause the fetal death or the IUD. So it's actually 100 milligrams. So it's not 150 milligrams. So this option is also not right. Of course, the first and the third statement are wrong. The correct answer for this question would be B, that is concealed abruption. Is it clear to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Right, we'll go to the next one. Here, all of you observe, this is a picture and what is depicted in the following picture. This is placenta previa, placenta accreta, cuvular uterus, or none of the above. What is the right answer here? Can you all identify the picture? It's a picture of the uterus. Okay. It's actually the postpartum uterus, to be more specific. You can see the tube and the ovary here.
Option C.
Yeah, that is the right answer. That is the cuvular uterus. Okay. So when we think about abruptio placentae, cuvular uterus is one pathological feature which is seen in abruptio placentae. Okay. So you can see here, this is the uterus and it is dark blood which is seen within the wall of the uterus. Can you see? So here it's a postpartum uterus. You can see it is cut open here, probably a picture of a cesarean delivery after the delivery of the baby. So they can see the blood disseminated into the uterine musculature and even in the subserosal area or just just below the serous layer of the uterus, you can see these blood seeping into the uterine walls. So this is a typical picture of the covular uterus, which is a feature or a pathological feature which is seen after abruptio placentae. Mainly, mostly it is seen with a severe degree of the abruptio placentae. Okay, it's clear for everyone.
Yes, ma'am.
Few points about covular uterus. It is also called as uterine apoplexy. Okay, and it was first demonstrated by Cuvier as a pathological finding in the severe form of abruption. This is the name of the scientist or the doctor. Massive intravascularization of the blood is seen into the uterine musculature even up till the serous layer of the uterus, and it can be diagnosed only on laparotomy. Since it's a pathological, gross pathological feature. So whenever there is a patient with abruptio placentae ending up in cesarean section, we get to see such kind of covular uterus. Okay, see the typical color what is described is dark port wine color of the uterus, which is seen because of the blood seeping into the musculature. Another important thing what you have to remember about this is most of the time it does not interfere with the uterine contractions following the delivery of the baby. So there is no higher incidence of postpartum hemorrhage because of the covular uterus. And another thing you remember is it is presence of covular uterus is per se not an indication for hysterectomy, unless the patient is actually having uterine atony and there is a postpartum hemorrhage, then only the patient can be subjected to hysterectomy. But whenever there is a covular uterus, most of the times the uterus contracts and retracts and there is no uterine atony and no postpartum hemorrhage. So we need not go for a hysterectomy, only for covular uterus. But it is seen, it is an important pathological feature, and whenever there is a covular uterus, you can grade the abruption into a severe variety and take more precautions and monitor the patient much better for any complications you can develop, like we discussed, like renal failure or even DIC. All those things have to be kept in mind more often whenever you are seeing a covular uterus in a patient with abruptio placentae. So is it clear to all of you?
Ma'am,
Yes.
if C-section is done in such cases, won't the bleeding be excess?
The bleeding will be excess only in case the patient is in DIC. Okay. So just with a minor degree or the grade 0, 1, 2 grades of abruptio placentae, the patient is not in DIC, and there is a chance of the baby being salvaged, like it's just a fetal distress, and because when you do an immediate cesarean section, the baby is salvageable, the baby can be saved, we go ahead with the cesarean section unless the patient is in the DIC. So immediately when the patient comes to us, we send all these investigations, or if at all we don't have the setup for the investigation, we do this bedside blood clotting test as we discussed. Okay, so once that the BT-CT is done and within 6 minutes the normal BT is there and the clotting time is also normal, it indicates that the patient is not in DIC immediately. And if there is a fetal distress, the chance of saving the baby is there, we go ahead with cesarean section and do cesarean section for this patient. Only in severe degree of abruption, when the patient is in shock and the clotting factors are deranged, the clotting tests are deranged, and the patient is in obvious DIC, in such cases we can't go for a laparotomy. Okay, even though the fetal distress is there, we think that the baby could be survived, we don't go for laparotomy, because as you said, there will be very high chances of the patient bleeding from all the sides, starting from the site of the incision, postpartum, even from the uterine incision, she'll start bleeding. So whenever the patient is in DIC, we never go for laparotomy immediately or cesarean section immediately. We have to correct the DIC first by giving her the fresh frozen plasma, and then go for a cesarean section if required. Is it clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, fine. So we'll continue with the next question. Now here, a 22-year-old gravida 2 para 1 at 28 weeks gestation presents with rupture of membranes about 2 hours ago. What is true about this patient concerning abruption? A, she has a 5% risk of abruption. B, she has a 17% risk of abruption. C, her risk for abruption is not increased, or none of the above. This is again a theoretical question, but you should be remembering. First thing is whether premature rupture of the membranes is a risk factor for abruption or no. Is there an increased incidence of abruption in patients with PROM or like rupture of the membranes? Whenever we do an ARM, there is sudden decompression sometimes occurring in case of ARM. Is it not? So sudden decompression will result in the sudden what you call decrease in the size of the uterus, and the placental attachment surface also suddenly kind of shrinks. So there could be the possibility of premature separation of the placenta or abruption. Is it not? Hello, are you all there? I hope there is no technical issue again. Students?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so as we were discussing, there is a risk whenever there is an ARM or rupture of the membranes. Okay, so the options C and D are ruled out as because they mentioned there is no risk and none of the above. Now we are left with two options. So this is again a theoretical thing. What you have to remember: how much is the risk of abruption with the patients with the ARM, whether it is 5% or 17%. Anybody has an answer for this? Yes. So I'll give you the answer, not waiting longer. It is A, the option is A, that is 5%. So remember, there is an increased risk of abruption in a patient undergoing rupture of the membranes, especially so in case of hydramnios or even multiple pregnancies where there is sudden decompression by rupture of the membranes, and the sudden detachment of the placenta could be there because of the shrinkage of the placental surface. So there is increase of abruption, and in rupture of membranes or the ARM, the risk is 5%. Okay. So shall we proceed? All of you are there?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So we'll go to the next question. Now you can see the picture is a histological picture. So the question here is, the slide pictured below is consistent with a fetal syndrome. Which of the following proposed diagnostic criteria are required to make the diagnosis? A, clinical onset during labor or within 30 minutes of placental delivery. Abrupt onset of cardiorespiratory arrest or both hypotension and respiratory compromise. C, documentation of overt disseminated intravascular coagulopathy must be detected prior to enough blood loss to cause dilutional coagulopathy. D, all of the above. So first you have to think, what is this histological picture depicting? So you have to make a diagnosis first and then come to these statements, whether these statements are correct for that particular diagnosis you have made. So anybody can comment on this particular picture here, the histological picture, what you are able to see. See, with the help of these options, whatever they have given, even though you don't understand this histological picture, you should come to a rough diagnosis as to what condition they are talking about. See, one is they have given a fetal syndrome. Okay. Fetal syndrome, and they have mentioned that it is related to pregnancy. That is, either it should be in labor or immediately after the delivery, that 30 minutes of placental delivery. That means it's related to labor, delivery, postpartum period, and it is a fetal syndrome. So which is that condition in question that they are kind of talking about here in this particular statement? Anybody? Hello, students. I hope there is no disconnection. Are you all there?
Yes, ma'am. Don't know the answer, ma'am. That's it.
Okay, so if you don't know, please mention that you don't know and don't sit quietly, because I'll think that there's some technical problem again. So see here, as we were discussing, there is a fetal syndrome and related to pregnancy. So which is that condition which is a fetal syndrome, and fetal in the sense which is associated with a very high mortality, is it not? So which is that condition which is associated with a very high maternal mortality? We discussed in the previous slides about this. It is amniotic fluid embolism, is it not? So the
Yes,
option
ma'am.
here, which is the first option, they're saying that it should occur during labor or after delivery of the placenta, 30 minutes after delivery. So as we discussed earlier, amniotic fluid embolism is a condition timing, if you have noted in the earlier slide, that it is most common during the late stages of the labor or immediately after the delivery of the placenta, that is postpartum period, or whenever there is an ARM occurring or there is an abruption. Is it not? So here the condition in question is actually an amniotic fluid embolism. And what you're seeing in this picture, that is the histological picture, you can see these small thread-like things here. You can see like small thread-like things, is it not? In this particular vessel. So this is a picture of the lung, okay? And what you're seeing is a blood vessel here, a major blood vessel in the lungs. Okay, and you can see small hair-like things in this vessel. Got it? Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So you're getting this, like you can see the small hair-like things here, this thread-like things, and this is actually a cut section of the major pulmonary vessel. Okay, so there you can find this is nothing but the fetal hair or the lanugo, which gets disseminated in case of amniotic fluid embolism. Okay, it gets disseminated into the intravascular system of the mother. It clogs these pulmonary vessels in the lungs. Okay, and then that leads to severe respiratory distress and subsequent cardiac failure and death of the patient. Okay, so this particular histological picture is of the this is a pulmonary vessel in the lungs, and you can see these small hair-like structures in the pulmonary vessel or a major pulmonary vessel in the lungs. So this is actually the condition which they are talking about is the amniotic fluid embolism. Okay, so as we discussed, the first option is the right option here. The second one, if you come to, this is abrupt onset of cardiorespiratory arrest, and it might lead to hypotension as well as respiratory compromise. So this statement is also correct. This is a typical picture what is seen in a patient developing amniotic fluid embolism. Okay. And another thing, as we discussed, that amniotic fluid embolism is associated with the DIC always, most of the times, and the patient will end up in hemorrhage as well. So that's why even the third option is right option. So the answer here for this particular question is all of the above. Okay, so all these features are suggestive of amniotic fluid embolism, and this is a typical histological picture which shows the presence of lanugo hair in the intravascular system of the patient, that is nothing but a pulmonary vessel. So is it clear to all of you? You can appreciate the picture as well as the question based on that.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so is there any doubt? Should we go ahead?
Yes, ma'am.
Fine. The next question here is, which of the bacteria below are associated with consumptive coagulopathy or DIC? There has been an association of bacterial infections associated with DIC. Options here is E. coli, Klebsiella pneumoniae, group A Streptococcus, or group B Streptococcus. Anybody has any idea about this? or maybe I can elaborate if you people are not familiar with this question. This is a very a tough question in the sense it's a not commonly discussed one as a cause of DIC or abruptio placentae. Anybody? Anybody can give a wild guess also here. See, logically, if you want to answer this question, now here E. coli, first option. E. coli, most of the times it causes what kind of infection in females especially?
UTIs.
UTI.
UTI, is it not? So do you see DIC commonly in the UTI?
No.
No, so that could not be an option, is it not? Now coming to second one, the Klebsiella pneumoniae. Klebsiella is most of the time it is a nosocomial infection, is it not? So most of the times it is associated in the form of wound infection or patients who are there in the ICU. So this is usually a nosocomial infection in Klebsiella pneumoniae, and that leading to DIC is there in very late stages. If the patient is going into septicemia, septic shock, and then going into DIC is a possibility with Klebsiella, but not very commonly. And in question here in obstetrics or during pregnancy. Okay. So this is not the option. Now coming to these two options, that is C and D. Here it is group A and group B streptococcus. Most of the times when we have studied about the infections during the pregnancy or in any females, most of the times what we have studied is mainly the group B streptococcus infections. Is it not? So the group B streptococcus infections are common in patients who are having PROM or preterm labor or even puerperal sepsis. So in such cases, the infection could be caused by group B streptococcus. Is it not? And the features of group B streptococcus is that it will present with the septic shock syndrome also. Have you all read about septic shock syndrome where some of the patients might present? You've read in your theory, is it not? So in the shock chapter, whenever there is a causes of shock in the pregnancy or the obstetrics, most common is hemorrhagic shock. Then there could be even septic shock that is caused because of toxic shock syndrome. That's also called as a toxic shock syndrome. So here, the group B streptococcal infection is the culprit that causes toxic shock syndrome, and the patient might be having a fatal course here. Have you all read about this? The group B streptococcal infection leading to toxic shock syndrome?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so that is a common condition, and that will lead to like complications as we discussed in the form of preterm labor, PROM, or even puerperal sepsis. Okay, so whereas here the third option, that is group A streptococcus, is not that commonly seen in the pregnancy. It's a very rare infection. Group B is common, but group A infection is quite rare. Okay, so actual answer here is the C1, that is the group A streptococcus. So there has been studies where they have found patients who have had a group A streptococcal infections to be more prone for abruptio placentae and subsequently DIC. Okay, so this is a recent advances, and recent studies have proven that patients with a group A streptococcal infection will be prone to abruptio as well as subsequently to DIC, that is nothing but consumptive coagulopathy. Okay, so the answer here would be group A streptococcus for this one. Now, a few points about group A streptococcal infection. Remember that few studies have shown that it is more common in multiparous women, especially in the third trimester. They may also get infected postpartum, but if they get affected in the third trimester, they present usually with the flu-like symptoms. It will affect the upper respiratory tract first, as in group B streptococcal infection. So group A streptococcal also will affect the upper respiratory tract, and the patient will present with flu-like symptoms such as high fever and upper respiratory and sometimes GI symptoms. What is a characteristic finding here is the patient immediately or very acutely worsens into toxic shock syndrome, resulting in shock and infection. This will produce a strong uterine contraction, and that is because of the placental abruption. So this is a very characteristic finding what they've noted in a patient with a group-A streptococcal infection, resulting in strong uterine contraction and placental abruption, and then the patient ending up in shock. So this is a typical characteristic feature what they have found. And here the clinical course is very acute and severe, and it is very difficult sometimes to rescue the mother as well as the infant. But because of the recent administration of early antibiotics and as well as intravenous immunoglobulins, they have been able to salvage a few lives of the mothers as well as the infants. So this has recent advances in case of streptococcal infections and association with the placental abruption and DIC. So is it clear for all of you? Now, group B streptococcal, as we discussed, results in maternal complications like PROM, preterm labor, puerperal sepsis, endometritis, even UTI and wound infection. Neonatal complications associated with group B streptococcal infection is RDS, pneumonia, sorry, septicemia, and meningitis. Excuse me. So this is about the group A and group B streptococcal infection, and the answer for this question, as we discussed, is the right one would be group A streptococcus, which is associated with abruption and DIC. So is it clear to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
So this was the last question in this series of antepartum hemorrhage. So I have taken a lot of questions involving different aspects of the antepartum hemorrhage, that is placenta previa, abruptio placentae, the etiological factors, the management aspects, and also the differential diagnosis, the complications. As I've tried to cover all the the subsets for these particular topic, that is APH. So I hope it is clear to all of you.
Yes,
Now
ma'am.
you should be able to confidently answer any questions based on the antepartum hemorrhage with this knowledge regarding the